factual evidence, context, and recent natural disasters. Now, this guy's gone to a few disasters. If you look at the list in unintentionally, yeah. They might call him a master of disaster, but no, he's master of disaster response. So we welcome Norm to us. He's going to give us some overviews, the impact of recent disasters and natural disasters, sorry. But his background, he's obviously a gifted communicator, and he's going to communicate to us the message he's got for us. Thank you, Norm.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our symposium. I sit on the board of the EUSI, so I'm always proud when we get together for this and that we do this each year. If you've been with us before, you know that I usually start out the symposium trying to put some historic context into where we are to sort of frame the questions, and recently to bring some humor to the topics that we talk about, because they are fairly serious. This one too, though, doesn't lend itself to a whole lot of humor because we're talking about natural disasters. And then I remembered a story as I was sitting at my table. I remembered a story where I'm a volunteer emergency medical tech, and at one time my sister was a paramedic and my mom a surgical nurse. So we certainly had a medical theme going on in the family. And my sister was riding ambulance one night, and I called her in Estevan, Saskatchewan, and said, "How's the night going?" She said, "It's going great." And then a conversation followed that could only happen in a medical family, where she said, "However, I need to get a heart attack tonight." And I said, "What do you mean you need a heart attack?" She said, "If I don't treat somebody with a heart attack, I have to recertify, and I don't want to go back to the classroom and recertify." About 2 hours later, she called me with a cheery sound in her voice saying, "Got my heart attack." So when we talk about all of this, we want to put it in some type of context. People who live with it, deal with it every day, and I'm no longer one of those, find a way to make it through. But that's what this conference is about, is what is the best way that we handle natural disasters. So in an effort not to make this just a complete litany of bad news, I wanted to put it in some context and finish with some thoughts on Katrina, the hurricane in 2005 in New Orleans, to give you thoughts about what might have to happen. And as happened at our table this morning, the discussion was clear. There's a difference between an emergency. There's a difference between emergencies and disasters. An emergency is something that can be handled, particularly locally, maybe with some assistance. And then we have the mega things. The tidal wave in the tsunami in Indonesia, in Japan, Katrina, which takes out an entire city, and what the implications are as we go along. So the Canadian military, and I will not get into the details of how these are deployed. We have experts in the room who will do that for you today. But Operation Lentus is the standing, is a standing operation that deploys in times of natural disasters in Canada. It is done at the request of other authorities. So the military does not just jump in and come to the rescue, but other authorities have to ask. It has recently been brought up by the Canadian military that the continuing call on the military is causing stresses in terms of resources, etc. Since 2010, just put this into context, since 2010, the number of calls upon the military has doubled year on year. Doubled year on year in terms of being used to assist in natural disasters. So what does that look like in just some quick look here? What are they doing? Well, it's pretty much anything and everything. Everything from checking on welfare checks in terms of floods, fires, etc., going door to door, to actually doing heavy lift work, including with the new, relatively new C-17s. They are there doing whatever is required of them by the civilian authorities. So while they are used as a support to the military or to the civilian authorities, they are doing just about everything you would expect in a natural disaster. There's very little that they wouldn't do. In fact, I noted that in one of the operations on First Nations, the officers and men of the Canadian Armed Forces were cutting, stacking, and hauling firewood, because that was what heated many of the homes and was what needed to be done. So they were on firewood duty. This is the level that they go to. How many can be deployed? Sorry, how many are deployed? Sorry, back up a second here. How many are deployed? About anywhere, the smallest typical deployment is 30 people. It has been as large as 2,000 people out in the field doing work during a natural disaster. And the operations are always done to make sure that when they are there, they are not making themselves so indispensable they have to stay forever, that they have to stay until the end. Is to create that relief for people to work through. And so when we talk about what it looked like, the history of Lentis, before Lentis existed, the very first major deployment of Canadian troops was to the Winnipeg flood of 1950. I'm going to recognize that no one here was at the Winnipeg flood of 1950, myself included, but I lived in Winnipeg for 15 years, left in 95, and people were still talking about it. It hung as sort of Damocles over Winnipeg, despite the fact that in the end day, in 1950s, they built what was called Duff's Ditch, which was a big water diversion system around the city. Using the technologies in the 1950s, Winnipeg built it so that it was essentially a dam that stopped the water from going into the city, but the water had to build up and then spill over the spillway, which meant Winnipeg was safe, but Selkirk was doomed, right? Because anything north of Winnipeg got flooded because they were diverting the water around Winnipeg. But the Winnipeg flood indicated that there was a need for a change. There was a need for a way to make all of this work. And so fast forward to one that we're probably all familiar with. I started with a local company here in Edmonton called Driving Force. And within 3 days, my job was to evacuate 40 people from Fort MacMurray in terms of the fire. So as we look at these, and I'm not going to get, if anybody wants to in the question period, I'm happy to tell you how many troops, what equipment, but all of that sort of gets a little long to discuss all of that. But recognize that the Canadian military can deploy anything and everything they have in terms of a natural disaster. So that means people, aircraft, vehicles, communications equipment, whatever is required can be deployed in times of natural disaster. And they just continue, as I said. So big deployment 16 was Fort McMurray, but 17 we have floods in Quebec, floods in Newfoundland, floods in Kashuan, floods in Manitoba, floods in New Brunswick, and floods in Quebec. And all of these were where Canadian troops were deployed. All of these had Canadian troops deployed in terms of helping that local authority survive. And it is about survival and sometimes. Winter storm in Quebec, which I know we all laughed about that out here in the West, that we needed to deploy the troops for a winter storm in winter in Canada. But it was serious. It was serious in the sense that power lines were down, people were unheated, homes were unheated. Again, here in the West, we tend to trust natural gas pipelines will bring the heat right to our house. In places like Quebec and parts of Ontario, and certainly in the Maritimes, home heating oil is used, which means a truck has to deliver the oil to your house and fill a tank in your house. And if the roads are down, you're unheated. So it's not so funny anymore. It's no longer so funny when we think about not being able to heat our homes. We have wildfires in Manitoba, floods in New Brunswick. All of these are things that Operation Lentis supported, including evacuations of First Nations where it's fly-in only. So to get somebody out of there, we need to fly things like the Hercules in, to fly entire communities out in terms of forest fire, flooding, etc., where there just simply is no opportunity to bring somebody out by road. I had the honor of being the head of the Manitoba Chamber of Commerce for a number of years, and trust me, it's absolutely true. You can only get into some of these places, particularly in Manitoba, by ice roads, etc. When we talk about what the Canadian military has done, the litany just continues. The list just continues to grow and grow. What I want to move to the question period over, though, is the thought of what if. So Katrina, the hurricane in New Orleans in 2005 showed some structural weaknesses in what we were thinking about. And some of our table was chatting about this just before over muffins and coffee, that we know the city of Calgary did a survey about 10 years ago and predicted that first responders would start to collapse in about 18 hours. Now, collapse does not mean the individuals, but it meant the systems. Because when police, fire, and ambulance, to paraphrase somebody at my table, when they respond 100%. They give everything, which means that the average person is starting to get darn tuckered out by about 24 hours of service. And if every resource was thrown into deployment, that means your police, fire, and ambulance then look to the volunteers, people like me, to step in and try to fill the holes that they naturally have to leave. Katrina added a different dimension. Katrina added the dimension that because it was an entire city, an entire part of a state that collapsed, 40% of first responders within 3 days were not reporting for work. 40% were not reporting to work because they were either completely exhausted or they were worried about their own families, which is a natural thought, right? If you have, Scott's nodding, if you have your family's a threat, your home's a threat, it's hard to get motivated to get your uniform on and go to work protecting somebody else in an entire collapse. Now, this is something we can talk about today, is what is the right response if we hit that? If Vancouver gets that 8.0 earthquake that shakes it to its core, this would be that kind of an event. What happens if? Because we know that first responders are, if nothing else, human beings. They will respond quickly and they will respond affirmatively, but only for so long, simply on exhaustion or concern for their families. So as we talk about this today, we think about the history where the military has stepped in. The military has indicated they're at the end of their rope for what they can do. With the resources they have, with the people they have, with the equipment they have, they're at the end. If we continue to double year on year without making some type of allowance, that is more troops, more money, more something, a clearer mandate, they will, just like the first responders, hit the end of the rope. And then Canada has to ask what happens if that 8.2, 8.7 hits Vancouver and shakes everything to the core. And in some places, we live with this. My wife is from Mexico City. She lived through the 8.5 in 85. We have personally experienced 6.7s in Mexico City. They're used to it. Their responders know how to deal with this. We're not. And so we have to decide what's the right answers. So with that, I'm going to stop. I'm going to answer any questions you might have, and then turn it over to the experts to talk about it. And I did want to say good morning to Brian Hodgson, who's sitting down in the front row. Good morning, Brian. Good morning. Thank you. Anybody else? Questions? Yeah.
So just curious.
Sorry, before we start the question, would you mind speaking into the microphone so those at home can hear your?
Absolutely. So we're seeing an increase in the request for military assistance across the country.
Right.
And you mentioned that if something doesn't change, more military, more money, et cetera, that this is going to continue. And going back to 1998 in Toronto, when we saw the first deployment of Canadian military to bail out the city of Toronto, had snow.
Right.
It's only going to get worse. We're in the midst of climate change. What are your thoughts around the federal government taking more affirmative action towards funding municipalities to increase their sustainability and resilience with respect to response activities, and providing more money to build a better network within the municipalities so that we don't have to rely on that military component to come and bail us out?
I think the answer is first set what is, and this is from a historical context. There's people in the room who are experts on what's happening today. That there has to be a policy that says what it looks like. Because if you look at it now, what happens is municipalities are not forced to spend that money knowing that the military is there as their life jacket. It's there as a life jacket. when the request is made to the military, the immediate response from Canadians in general, well, of course the military can do it. They have unlimited resources. You know, I point out that I point out this to my American colleagues quite a bit, that Fort Hood in Texas has enough room on the entire base. If you just take Fort Hood, United States, you could put the entire Canadian Armed Forces, every man and woman serving, including my daughter, would be fitting on Fort Hood with room left over. So we don't have unlimited resources. We don't have, but because the assumption is the military does have unlimited resources, if the military says no, the military says we can't do it, we don't have enough people, the first call is to the minister, who looks at, do I need to continue the conversation? And we know what the minister is going to do. They're going to do what's politically expedient, not what's necessarily right. And that, by the way, I said minister. I did not say which party. It's the minister. It's how ministers react. It's what they do. So unless we have a policy that says this is what happens, so whether that policy includes more money for municipalities, a higher threshold for calling the military, whatever that solution is, it'll come from meetings like this. Is that a good politician's answer, Scott? Did I duck that good enough?
That's good, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have another question at the back here.
It's not really a question, just a point of information. The federal government does have policies and the action to increase resilience within communities. It's called the Humanitarian Workforce COVID-19 and other large-scale emergencies, where funding is circulated down to organizations to build workforce.
And I don't disagree with you.
I know St. John's has got some starting to build their numbers up. I know the search and rescue has got that. I don't know what other organizations have tapped into this fund, but it's available for municipalities and lots of others.
And I agree. It's about what's that unified look? What is it? How does it look unified across the country? Okay. Right at the back there, Brian.
Thank you. One of the advantages of not just building local resilience is when you have a disaster and the entire city's on fire, you evacuate everybody and whatever you built in is lost or has to be left behind. The advantage of bringing in the military or some other organization is they come from the outside and their families are not in that community. Their house is not in that community, drawing their attention. They can bring resources with them from outside and they can move people to places away from the disaster. Many of these things were totally wiped. Look at New Orleans. They had to remove people to Texas. Having something in New Orleans really wasn't the answer.
No, I agree with you. Absolutely. And it's the challenge we face. You're absolutely right. It's why we have a police officer on our street and he was out walking the dog and I spoke to him for a few minutes about the 2 officers lost. And he said the only thought that went through his head, please don't let them be somebody I know. Please don't let them be, because then it becomes emotional, right? Then it becomes something different than simple, I have a job to do. Okay. Anything else? Okay, well, if there isn't, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate your time. Thank you. Welcome to our symposium. Welcome to the USI. Thank you to everybody who put this together today for us. And I'm going to be staying for all of the presentations, not the least of which the last speaker is sitting right next to me, so it's hard to sneak out. So, Ben's laughing. So I look forward to seeing you through the day and chatting more about this. And I really want to hear what the experts have to say. Thank you, everybody.